Episode 288, The Victor. Art pondered for a moment and finally decided that he would take Damon to meet Paul. "I'll take you to see him now," he told him. He knew that Damon was a notorious fighter from the Blood Brothers gang. He should easily beat Paul. As a result of his inquiries, Art had found out that Paul lived at the No Surrender martial arts camp, but he hadn't been able to find out whether he had agreed to fight for the Clifton family. "Go to the No Surrender martial arts camp," Art told the driver. They would go there first to look for Paul. The car changed direction and drove toward the training camp, which was on the outskirts of Baltimore. Along the way, Damon looked out of the window at the familiar landscape of Maryland. After being away from the East Coast for so many years, he was finally back. The view outside the window slowly rose from high-rise buildings to mountains, and the wind was so strong that the trees were swaying. Gradually, a building with green tiles and red walls came into view. They had reached the No Surrender martial arts camp. Art, Chris, and Damon climbed out of the car. There were 4 young men dressed entirely in black, standing at the gates of the camp. They were Chris's bodyguards. He had ordered them to meet them there to protect him and his father. The battle between Damon and Paul was going to be fierce, and he didn't want himself or his father to get hurt. Art knocked on the gate, and 2 men opened it. When they saw the 3 men, they were surprised and concerned. They could see that these strangers were not friendly. "Hello, we're looking for Paul Novak. Is he here?" Art asked politely. "Mr. Novak?" When they heard that the men were looking for Paul, they knew they were right to feel anxious, and they hesitated. The last time visitors had come for Paul, several people had been hurt. "Take us to see him, please," Art said patiently. He was determined to stay calm. "Of course," said one of the men. He gave a small bow and then turned and walked toward the back of the building. The men led Art, Chris, and Damon along a path that wound through the walled gardens and arrived at a small back door. They passed through the door and out toward the mountains to the edge of a cliff. Since he was defeated by Alex, Paul had returned to the martial arts camp to practice and improve his technique. He relived his fight with Alex repeatedly, trying to see where he had gone wrong. He practiced and perfected many new moves. Being defeated by Alex was a terrible blow to his ego, and he had felt very depressed since it happened. He felt that his 30 years of martial arts training had been in vain. After 10 minutes walking along the cliff, they finally saw Paul. He was sitting on a huge rock on the edge of the cliff. "That's Mr. Novak," one of the men said in a trembling voice. Art looked at Paul, then back at the man. Now they had found Paul. They needed the 2 men to leave them alone with him. "Thank you. Now please leave us alone," he said. Damon stepped forward. Holding his fists up and with his head raised, he looked at Paul and called out to him, "Hey, you!" Paul opened his eyes and looked over at them. Slowly he stood up. No one ever dared to speak to him like that. His anger rose sharply. When he recognized that Art was standing behind Damon, Paul calmed down a little. He knew that in Baltimore, the Stedman and Clifton families were enemies, He asked himself, what do the Stedmans want with me? Who are you? He asked. From the fact that Art was with this man, he knew he was there to fight him. Have you ever heard of Damon Walker from the Blood Brothers gang? Damon asked. I've heard of the Blood Brothers gang, Paul replied. He wasn't surprised. He had been heavily involved in martial arts for more than 10 years and knew a lot about the history of the martial arts movements in both China and America. He continued, 100 years ago, Hu Juli, the founder of the Blood Brothers, betrayed his original gang, causing the deaths of hundreds of fighters. Later, he fled to the West Coast and founded the Blood Brothers gang in Los Angeles. The Blood Brothers are now a powerful gang who use martial arts fighters to act as enforcers and protectors for America's underworld. Ha! Damon denounced angrily. He said, the East Coast Dragons massacred more than 120 of our ancestors. The Blood Brothers have been waiting all this time to avenge their blood debt. He continued, today I'm here to take your life on behalf of the Stedman family. Let's begin. You arrogant son of a bitch, Paul yelled. Someone like you cannot distinguish between good and evil. I will happily kill you and any other Blood Brothers I can find. Paul sprang up and contorted his hand into a knife-like shape. He had been depressed since his defeat by Alex. Now he had a chance to recover his self-esteem and prove himself once again. He wanted to use Damon's blood to pay homage to the dead of the East Coast martial arts fighters before him. The move that Paul used was skillful, but well-known. When they saw Paul's attack arc through the air and his body move as fast as lightning, Art and Chris quickly stepped back so that they didn't get hurt. In the blink of an eye, Paul was standing in front of Damon, but his opponent stood stock still. He looked at Paul dispassionately, as if he didn't care about him at all. Paul held his blade closer to Damon's neck. Art held his breath, thinking that at any moment he would hit the young man's neck and kill him. When Paul's hand was only a few inches from his skin, Damon finally made his move. He pulled in his legs and suddenly he was a few feet away. It seemed impossible that he could have escaped, but he had. Paul's blow had cut through nothing but air. Paul gasped in shock. How could this man have avoided his attack? Suddenly he felt afraid of Damon. He had a terrible feeling that he could not beat this opponent. Damon looked at Paul with a cold smile and said, I heard that you're a master of martial arts, but is that all you've got? I've got more than enough skill to kill you, Paul yelled as he rushed at Damon again. His body twirled and his feet kicked out at his opponent. To the spectators, it seemed that Damon reacted very slowly. But in reality, his movements were lightning fast. He was quicker and more agile than Paul, and in less than a second, he'd blocked his opponent's attack and hit him in the chest. Paul tried to attack him, but only managed to graze his arm. Damon's movements were so agile, and his body was so light that he appeared to move like the wind. By the time Paul drew near him, he had already dodged out of the way. As each man paused to catch their breath, Paul looked up at the sky and thought desperately, how can this young man be so powerful? Damon shook his head and sighed. It seems that all true martial arts experts on the East Coast are dead. I find it pitiful that a fighter like you can be called an expert, he said. He was happy to discover that his enemies were so weak. His comment infuriated Paul. "Shut your mouth," he yelled. He knew that he was being shown up in front of everyone. Paul took a deep breath and then straightened his body and launched himself in the air like a torpedo. "It's my turn to show you what I can do," he cried. He thought, "Now let's see what you're really made of." At the same moment, Damon also rushed at his opponent. As before, his movements seemed slow, but his speed was actually extremely fast. When there were only a few yards separating him from Paul, he moved even faster. The whirlwind of his kicking legs gave the impression that he had 10 legs instead of just 2. Before Paul could reach him, he kicked him hard in the chest, and Paul fell to the ground. He vomited a mouthful of red liquid onto the ground and felt that all his internal organs had been kicked to pieces. If he moved his body a little, his stomach cramped in agony. Paul looked up at Damon and said in wonder, "Shinshinbu?" He was referring to the martial arts technique used by Damon. He had never seen it used before, but he had heard of it. He had never expected to experience it used on him. Shinshibu was an ancient martial arts style from 19th century China. At the time that Hu Juli had founded the Blood Brothers, it had gradually declined in popularity over the years. In recent years, it had almost disappeared altogether. After Hu Juli had arrived in California and founded the Blood Brothers gang, he wrote down everything he knew about martial arts into books for later generations to learn from. He also hoped that one day he could return to the East Coast to avenge the blood feud of the rival gangs against his family. "Ah, so you're not as ignorant as you look," Damon said. He slowly walked over to Paul with a ruthless expression on his face. Every member of the sect had been drilled on the purpose and mission of the Blood Brothers gang. The tens and thousands of members all knew about the blood feud between the gang and the rivals on the East Coast. Damon had grown up in the Blood Brothers and had a deep understanding of their history. And now, in front of him, was a man who had been disrespectful to the Blood Brothers. He walked up to Paul and kicked him in the head. Paul was almost unconscious as he lay on the ground like a dead dog. Damon showed no mercy as he kicked him again. Paul soared into the air, and his body landed right on the edge of the cliff. The sudden landing jolted him back to awareness, and still dazed, he grabbed the edge of the cliff with his hands as his body was suspended over the edge. "Help me! I'm going to fall!" he managed to cry. "Huh!" Damon sneered. In his opinion, Paul was a joke. When dealing with his enemies, Damon never showed mercy. He stepped on Paul's hands with his feet and ground down heavily. "Ah!" Paul cried out, as he was forced to release his trampled hands, and he fell over the cliff. There was a scream, and after a few seconds, there was a loud thud.